Okay, as we mentioned before, today we have a special session. We will be discussing about improving the economic freedom of Bolivians. For this purpose, we have international guests. We are with leading academics, we are with leading researchers. We want to thank to the Economic and Business Faculty of the University Autonomous Gabriel René Moreno for promoting this TV program. We also appreciate the broadcast from Canal 11 Televisión Universitaria, the Channel 11 University Television. We always remember that the main purpose of this program is to discuss topics related to economics, but also social problems that affects to society, as also some trends in business. Here we have Fred MacMahon from Economic Freedom Studies in the Fraser Institute, which measures the Economic Freedom Index. Obviously, this index is globally and also by countries, in collaboration with more than 200 institutes and center studies around 100 countries in the world.
Yes.
Fred, welcome. For us, it's really an honor to be here with you.
It is an honor for me to be here.
Thank you. Roberto, thank you for being here too with us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, as an overview, economic freedom perhaps is one of the variable or factor that is a basic characteristic in developed countries, but also it seems is a challenge for developing economies. There is an index related with its measure. Perhaps, I don't know, we will question to our guest what is the purpose of this index, but what we have seen is that is related with rights, with individual property, with private property, and the rule of law. And also, we can mention regulation and protection in terms of business. Inclusively, we can correlate this index with other variables, for example, with well-being, prosperity, perhaps economic growth, and other variables more. So we want to begin our conversation with Fred. What exactly means economic freedom, or perhaps it is not exactly?
Economic freedom is simply the ability of individuals and families to make their own economic decisions, free of the heavy hand of government or the corrupt hand of crony capitalism. And very often the heavy hand of government goes with the corrupt hand of crony capitalism. We look at size of government. If government is too large, it reduces the space for free exchange. You mentioned the rule of law. That is the single most important aspect of economic freedom. If the rule of law is not strong and fair, the economic freedom of all, particularly the poor and the unprivileged, is eroded by the powerful. So a rule of law that can control the powerful, make everything fair, is key. Sound money, the only area that Bolivia does well in, though that may be hitting a wall with the currency crisis. Freedom to trade. Bolivia won't get prosperous with a market of 12 million people. Import substitution is not a good idea. Look around. You can't manufacture for a market of 12 million. And regulation. Regulation should not be zero, but it has to be fair and low.
Thank you. Given that definition of what economic freedom means, we want to ask to Roberto, what are the main components of this economic freedom index?
So well, actually, this idea of economic freedom has been studied for well over 25 years now. It's the first attempt ever to try and measure, to put a number on economic freedom. Now, in order to do this, you need your criteria that determine economic freedom. And there are 46, and sometimes this criteria grows year in and year out, but there are 46 different variables that are used to determine the levels of economic freedom of a country. But we can summarize them in 5 fundamental areas. As Fred mentioned, perhaps the most important one is rule of law. And there, I think, are 10 components that go into measuring rule of law. The second is sound money. Why is sound money important? Because a stable unit of account, monetary stability, is fundamental for the freedom that consumers and producers have to trade with each other, to invest, to save, and to exchange. A third component that Fred also mentioned is the size of government. If government owns everything, then you don't really have that much freedom to trade on the part of individuals. If government is strong but small and gets out of the way of exchange, then you have greater economic freedom. I think the regulatory environment, especially labor laws, are very important. And I forget what the fifth one is. A freedom for international trade. That is also extremely important, which means that people are able to trade not just within Bolivia or within a country, but also with our neighbors or with anybody in the world. We have to remember that free trade or exchange in international trade is among people, not among nations. It's the people that live in the country that trade with people that live in other countries. And that freedom is very important.
So when we talk about these more than 46 variables in 5 dimensions, and perhaps if we realize why economic freedom is important.
One of the fascinating things is the importance of economic freedom is obvious to anyone who looks around the world, and yet you find people denying the obvious. It's nations that have economic freedom that produce the best lives for their citizens. I'm going to take a quick detour. A lot of people try to claim the Nordic nations are socialist. There could be nothing further from the truth. The Nordic nations may have relatively high taxation, but in every other dimension of economic freedom, they are the most free market economies in the world. In fact, Denmark rates number 5th in economic freedom, ahead of my country, Canada, and well ahead of the United States. But all you have to do is look around the world. It's the nations with economic freedom that produce the best lives of their citizens. There are not boatloads of people taking off from the United States to enjoy the Bolivian socialism. There aren't boatloads of folks from Miami fleeing to Cuba. Wherever you look around the world, people are trying to move to economically free countries, the United States, Canada, the European countries, away from repressive regimes like Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. And it is just remarkable that the Bolivian government has Cuban and Venezuelan advisors. Are they really trying to recreate the disaster that is Venezuela and the tragedy that is Cuba here in Bolivia?
Okay, thank you. Before continuing with this topic related to economic freedom, we want to ask to Roberto how the world advanced in terms of, for example, poverty, life expectancy, or other economic developments in last decades.
Well, actually, the reports that are published by the Economic Freedom of the World always have a reflection on the levels of poverty and especially extreme poverty. Extreme poverty in the past 25 years has been cut in half as a result of growth in economic freedom. And for instance, countries that do not have high degrees of economic freedom compared to countries that do have a high degree of economic freedom, the difference between families living in extreme and moderate poverty and those in less free countries versus those in most free countries is amazing. There's an enormous gap. So even the poorest families in economically free countries earn much, much more, maybe 14, 15 times more than what the poorest families in less economically free countries too. So that's a very important aspect, because many times we confuse the debates about inequality with poverty. And one thing is poverty, and another thing is inequality. And we might have to address inequality at one point, as the Nordic countries do. But poverty, if we focus on poverty, the best way for families to come out of poverty and gain social mobility is to expand economic freedom, because that empowers them with much greater opportunities for inclusive prosperity.
Can I just add something quickly? In the most economically free countries in the world, the quarter most economically free countries in the world, the poorest 10% of the population has an income of $14,000 US. Just imagine if the average Bolivian earned as much as the poorest people in economically free countries.
Really interesting, really interesting. In terms of the Bolivian economy, so you have studied the Bolivian situation. So what are the main findings in your study of economic freedom for the Bolivian economy, or for the Bolivian case?
They are unfortunate. Bolivia is one of the poorest countries in the world, and it has one of the lowest levels of economic freedom in the world, about 120th out of 165 jurisdictions. The size of government for a country of Bolivia's development is huge. You spend about as much relative to the economy as Australia or Qatar, and that's unsustainable. But even worse, very low levels in the rule of law, which, as both Roberto and I have said, is the key thing. And sadly, you're 161st in labor market regulations. This is horrible for the poor and the disadvantaged, because labor market regulations keep the poor and the disadvantaged out of the marketplace. There are only 4 nations that have worse labor market regulations than Bolivia. And this is one of the reasons 80% of the people have to work in the informal economy without protections, because the regulations are too tough to get into the formal economy. I mean, the good news is Bolivia is better than North Korea.
Well, I don't know if it is good news. But for example, Roberto mentioned one dimension in terms of economic freedom index. For example, the size of government. How is the size of government in the Bolivian economy, for example, if we compare this indicator with other countries?
Let me just give you one example. Government investment, in other words, the share of government versus private sector investment. Investment in Bolivia, 2/3 of investment in Bolivia is from the government. That dominates the economy. What is the world average? About 20%. So Bolivia is more than 3 times above the world average. This just stifles the ability of the private sector to create jobs and prosperity.
So according to this question about the size of the government, Roberto, what is for you, what is the relationship between the size of the government, for example, if we compare with economic freedom and perhaps economic growth? What is this relationship?
Well, as Fred was saying, if you have government dominating a large portion of the economy, then the opportunities for growth and the opportunities for investment, for micro enterprises, for instance, is going to be stifled. It's like you have a straitjacket that you can't move very far. And that tends to hurt long-term growth. Many governments, what they do, as the case in Bolivia or the case of my home country in Mexico, for instance, is that the government begins to give out handouts. But those handouts, at most, can be a palliativo, a palliative. They're not going to solve the long-term problem of accumulating and generating new wealth. Now, what we do see, and I think is very good news for Bolivia, is that you have a very robust commercial society. And the informal economy itself, you can see that there's a great deal of trade and that there's a great deal of opportunity. And if you had the formal setting, if the government gave the space for those people to expand, I think you could have very high growth, and not just high growth, but sustained growth over 15-year periods, 20-year periods, which is really what you need in order to be able to capture new levels of prosperity. And I think it's a symbol of what Bolivia could do and what Bolivia needs in order to be able to generate a much greater standard of living.
Roberto, you come from Mexico. If we compare, for example, Bolivia with Mexico, how is the economic freedom in Mexico in comparison, for example, with Bolivia?
Mexico is less worse than Bolivia. It's not better, it's less worse. But for instance, Mexico does fairly well in international trade because we have, contrary to Bolivia, we do have trade agreements, and we've practiced trade liberalization for the past 30 years, which has been an enormous contributor to growth in Mexico. The size of government is not as bad as Bolivia, but where it's really bad is in rule of law. So it's like you have the 4 different variables, well, more or less okay, and some are better than others over here, but rule of law is like Afghanistan. Okay, that's the level, seriously. If you look at the Afghanistan rule of law and the Mexico rule of law, so what does that mean? In rule of law, it's things like, if I sign a contract, do I have the certainty that it's going to be enforced if there's a dispute? Or is it, le voy a dar su coima al juez? I don't know. Property rights, a little bit like Bolivia. Is my land, or can the government come and say, oh no, because of interest in social prosperity, I'm going to take it away? Oil, minerals, subsoil rights, police enforcement. I think you're far better in police matters than Mexico is, for instance. So all of that significantly reduces economic freedom, and that's why our overall, despite open trade, despite sound money, despite even the size of government, it's the rule of law that really puts Mexico down.
Well, I had the experience indeed in living in Mexico. I remember that yes, there was a little criticism about the trade, the open trade with the U.S. What is your position about? Well, trade is an indicator, is a dimension in terms of economic freedom. So, for the Mexican case, what do you think about the open trade?
I think it would be very difficult for you to find somebody that opposes open trade with the United States and Mexico. Even the most diehard Maoist is going to be in favor of open trade. Because today Mexico, after 30 years of trade integration in North America, and also with Canada is very important, our trade relationship with Canada is very important. Mexico sells more to the United States than any other country in the world. And it buys more from the United States than any other country in the world. And so that tells you, that's led to an enormous expansion of manufacturing investment, of aerospace concerns, and of integrated supply chains, which is remarkable. It's no longer, we should eliminate the balance of payments in North America, in my opinion, because it's so tightly integrated. So in that respect, I think it's been an important contributor to certain pockets of prosperity in Mexico.
Great explanation. We will continue making some relationships between the economic freedom. For example, when we study some factors that affect positively or negatively to economic growth, for example. What about institutional indicators, for example, corruption? What is the relationship between corruption, economic freedom, and perhaps economic growth?
Economic freedom is actually the best cure for corruption possibly. Now, lots of nations try various police forces, measures, special squads, and so on. and they tend not to work too well. The reason economic freedom is a cure for corruption, or a partial cure for corruption, nothing ever gets rid of it, it's human nature, but the reason it is if there's a lack of economic freedom, let's just look at regulations. Say the regulations are stringent and unclear, and the civil service has a lot of room to manipulate them. Then there's somebody to pay off, because you aren't sure you're going to get permission to do whatever you need to do, and there's a hand out. If, on the other hand, the regulations are simple and clear, and you can and you're economically free, and you can make your own decisions, there's no one to pay off because you're free to do it. So economic freedom, the ability to make your own economic decisions, means there's no one to pay off. Corruption withers.
You mentioned that perhaps economic freedom is, the best examples are advanced economies, developed economies. But Roberto, for example, if we want to mention some rugged nations that perhaps are not advanced or developed economies, do we have some examples for this?
Well, I don't know the most recent examples from the 2023, which is going to be unveiled very soon. In Latin America, despite all the bad press that we have received in the past 4 years, but from an economic standpoint, Chile is a very good example of how in the space of 4 generations, they were able to quadruple, I think, per capita income. So it's a very good example. And now with the new constitutional referendum, they're drafting a new constitution, but it's a much more common sense and reasonable constitution that pays attention to things like simple rules for a complex world. Great philosopher of law, Richard Epstein, says if you want to cure corruption, let's have simple rules that are general, and let people, according to those rules, decide how they're going to address a complex world. So Chile's been a good example. Interestingly enough, recently, Guyana has become an example of how greater economic freedom can lead to greater prosperity. I don't know the details of it, but I think it's a fascinating case to study. The Dominican Republic, which has Haiti right next door, that's a very good example, kind of like South Korea versus North Korea. You know, in one case, it's an absolute basket case and rife with corruption and crony capitalism. And in the other case, they even have a program called Burocracia Cero right now, which I think is admirable. Zero bureaucracy. Make life simple for those that work. That's their motto. It's not left wing, it's not right wing, it's not center, it's not ideological, it's just simply let me work. I think that other countries worldwide, I'm not fully familiar with the details, but in Africa, for instance, you begin to see some very important opportunities. Botswana has been a nation in Africa that has become an example to follow, and Mauritius also. Mauritius is another good example of how economic freedom can empower people with greater opportunities for inclusive prosperity. Uruguay recently in Latin America is yet another example, though in Uruguay the level of taxation, as in the Nordic countries, is the highest in all of Latin America. So there are many examples of how less developed nations, through economic freedom, can gain greater prosperity.
Can I touch that up with
Please.
Botswana, which Roberto mentioned, in 1960 had about half the average African income. Imagine that, poorer than sub-Saharan Africa, half the income. Now it's about 8-10 times the income. South Korea in 1960 would have been poorer than most Latin American nations. Now it's a first world country. Ireland was always the poorest nation in Northern Europe. It just did an economic revolution in the 1980s, moved to the top 10 in economic freedom. It's now 4 or 5 times the average income of Europe. Imagine that. And it works the other way. Argentina was once economically free, and it's a disaster. Believe it or not, in 1970, Venezuela was the 10th most economically free country in the world, and by far the richest country in Latin America on a per-person basis, and this was before oil prices spiked.
Now?
Now, remember, economic freedom can be eroded in two ways. Crony capitalism took charge in Venezuela. Economic freedom nosedived, so did Venezuela's growth, leading to Hugo Chavez and the disaster.
So in order to summarize, we have good experience like Chile, for example, was Botswana, you mentioned, South Korea, but we have the bad experience, such as, for example, Argentina and Venezuela, so that are the bad cases.
Yep.
The time was very short. We want to conclude our interview with Fred. For the Bolivian case, how can we improve the economic freedom of Bolivians?
Reduce the size of government, make a real effort to improve the rule of law. The regulatory environment can be changed very quickly. Unleash the entrepreneurship that Roberto was talking about in the informal sector. And I'm going to say something moderately dire right now. I worry about the future of Bolivia with the currency crisis approaching. Bolivia is not self-sufficient in food. If Bolivia cannot afford to import, there's a huge problem there. The oil price subsidies, which have if Bolivia can't afford those, there will be riots in the streets. And very unfortunately, when governments face crisis, they tend to crack down and get far worse, as in Venezuela. So unless Bolivia figures a way out of this currency crisis, real problems could occur. Bolivia could open up its economy, just like Roberto said, move to much higher levels of prosperity, but it has to be aware of the dangers of the crisis.
In that sense, you mentioned that perhaps the currency crisis is a potential risk for the Bolivian economy. So what is the relationship between, for example, the exchange policy rate with economic freedom? What I mean, what happened, for example, in the highest countries in terms of the index, obviously, with the exchange rate policy and economic freedom?
It's not so much the exchange rate policy, it's the Bolivian government's overspending. So when it had foreign currency, it just spent like a mad person. And it drained all its foreign currency out. So it's the huge size of government. A government Bolivia cannot afford, subsidies the Bolivian government cannot afford, that led to this. And that's a violation of economic freedom because it reduces the size of the private sector.
Okay, Roberto, please, the same question.
Just a very quick note. I do think, perhaps contrary to what Fred says, the exchange rate policy can be important because it ties in, independently of what he's saying about the subsidies, it does tie into the stability of the unit of account, la estabilidad de la moneda. And for instance, perhaps Bolivia could say, okay, if I'm going to have a fixed exchange rate policy, then it should be ultra fixed, and do like Ecuador did, dollarize, or Peru that has the option to do soles or dollars, or Guatemala or others. Or you can do a floating exchange rate, which perhaps that can also be very good. Let people decide where the currency is going to go, but let the people have the freedom to decide whether they want dollars or the local currency. And in that sense, that can be an important factor for economic freedom as well.
Okay, so to sum up, Fred, what conclusions and recommendations, suggestions we can highlight?
The great thing about the good news is that nations determine their own fate. It's not external donors or even mineral wealth. Nations with high levels of economic freedom become prosperous. Those that don't become poor, and Bolivia can change its fate into a rocket nation by improving economic freedom.
Okay. Roberto, any?
I completely agree. I think you have the potential to be a rocket nation and to capture extremely high levels of growth. It has the most important asset that Bolivia has is its people. And we have seen a great deal of robust commercial life here. There's a relative amount of peace and of community living. And if we're able to create the conditions, the economic and institutional conditions, in order to be able to rocket that commerce through international trade, for instance. What I would do, first thing I would do is labor law labor flexibility, so that what you see in El Alto, for instance, in La Paz, or the commerce that you see here in Santa Cruz can be catapulted into the formal economy.
Okay. The time for this interview was very short. We had many further questions. Fred and Roberto, thank you so much for all of your comments and significant contributions. Please, we kindly invite you for another interview in the near future.
Of course, be glad to.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. This was our main conversation, talking about improving the economic freedom of Bolivians. So we have some policies and challenges. And now we go to our institutional announcement, and then we continue with our program Economía y Negocios.